Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. Today, I welcome back a regular guest on the podcast, Peter Ambrose, CEO of the Partnership, firm based down in Guildford. And Peter and I have had various tete-a-tetes about technology, the role of technology and conveyancing. Today, we're going off on a slight tangent because we're going to talk about the impact of technology on consumers and the risks that a little knowledge is dangerous, a very famous phrase. Thanks so much for joining the podcast, Peter.
Delighted to be here again.
We're going to talk about your pet subject, AI, but before we do that, there may be some people out there who don't know who Peter Ambrose is. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yes, well, thanks for the introduction. As I run the Partnership. We're a law firm down in Surrey. We focus on London and the southeast market, just do residential, that's all we do. Roughly about 90 people, very heavily invested in technology, using technology to provide service rather than to replace expertise. We work with a lot of first-time buyers, so we see the problems particularly with BSA properties, with flats, do a lot of leasehold work. All of our business is based around how do we give really good service, but also balance the risk element to the job. Anyone that's involved in conveyancing knows today that most of their time is spent reducing risk either for their clients, for their lenders, or indeed for their own firm. And we spend a lot of time building and designing technology that reduces that risk. It
would be remiss of us not to say that you're also the Managing Director, CEO of Legalito. You spend a bit of time online talking about that. Again, another tech product. But as I say, not the topic of conversation for today. What I wanted to touch on was a topic that you raised in a recent article on Today's Conveyancer, which is the role that Google and artificial intelligence is playing in conveyancing from the consumer's point of view. You flagged the fact that we've spent years talking about and complaining about lay people using Google to search for issues with conveyancing. They're now asking AI, which is providing even greater detail in terms of complaints or issues that home movers might have about their conveyancer. It's giving them much more user-friendly information, but as I said at the start, a little information can be dangerous, and this is starting to prove challenging for conveyancers.
It is. If we look at what had happened in the past, typically on a Monday, we'd get a phone call from a client saying, I've spoken to a friend, or I've Googled such and such, and that advice that you gave me last week is not appropriate. We know this, we know that, and we've Googled it, and this is the question. And this has been a very, very common problem and part of our daily lives as lawyers really for the last 10, 15 years, certainly as long as I've been running the Partnership. The problem as we see it today is that people have now access to far greater resources and far more sophisticated resources than just Google search. And everybody knows this, the rise of the use of artificial intelligence, things like ChatGPT, Google Gemini is now becoming commonplace, and people are getting very comfortable using it. And what we are seeing, the use of this technology combined with a general breakdown in trust that we've seen since the end of the pandemic, has been that people are much more skeptical of what we're doing. They're very much more comfortable raising complaints about what we would have considered in the past to be very small issues and small items. But most worryingly, what we've seen over the last 6 months of the rise of the ChatGPT complaint, as I call it, more and more now what we're seeing is people are using GPT to formulate complaints after the deal has finished and we have sent them all the documents, and they're putting our documents through GPT, and they are picking out the minutiae of a case that we may or may not have picked up. We're only humans. We're here to manage risk. We're all under pressure. In the hands of tools like GPT, which are very good at spotting anomalies, which are very good at picking out certain details, we are now seeing clients armed, and I use that word reservedly, but with these weapons, because they genuinely are weapons, to deploy data against us. And we have seen this. And with my legalito hat on, I'm talking to a lot of law firms. This is now becoming commonplace.
And what does it look like? I mean, for the listeners that perhaps haven't had any experience of this.
It's the first thing. The first very notable thing is the complaints are much longer, whereas in the past it would be a
much
page.
More verbose.
Now, much more verbose, 2 or 3 times. Much more. Is flowery the right word? It's certainly much more detailed, and they identify anomalies far more effectively than they've ever done in the past. But as I say, the key, it's funny. People say, "Oh, how can you tell something to GPT?" You got like the M dash discussion. Oh, you can tell it because it uses an M dash. No, it's sheerly the number of words, and that's very noticeable. And people tell me this. They're saying they're getting much more lengthy complaints now.
We ought to have a professional indemnity insurer on the conversation here at this point that we could refer to. But I mean, is this a conversation you've had with your PIR?
I have had. We have had conversations. We work with one of the biggest ones here, one of the biggest brokers, and we sat down with them and had a very blunt conversation about 3 weeks ago, and said, "This is what we're seeing now." And they did agree. This is something that they were already seeing. So if it's got to the insurers that quickly, that means it's out. There's a lot of people using it. My view is it's almost a certainty that we're now going to see more claims on the back of this, because people are looking. Interestingly, where we get our most amount of complaints is where we've for example charged an abortive bill. So people are aggrieved, and that's where that happens. Or if there's a fall through, if they're buying and the seller pulls out, for example, where people feel they've been hard done by, then that's when it generates a complaint. When it comes to actual negligence claims, and I hate to use that word, but we have to, then that's where people have a problem, where they've been called up. Something has occurred in recent times, and in the past it would be a phone call, could you look into it? Now what we're seeing is, along with another trend as well, which is the rise of the SAR, whereby people are saying, I want to see all the contents. And I'm just thinking about it now. Why are we seeing? We've had 5 SARs this year. We didn't have any in the last couple of years. And I'm just thinking about it now. They want to get our data so they can run it through AI. Because what they're doing is that we have to redact it. But once they've got all our conversations and all our communications, they can take that data. Now, we haven't any evidence of that, but it doesn't surprise me just thinking about it now, because we couldn't explain why we were getting more SARs. Very strange.
You've always been very transparent about your business, and you've told me in the course of the discussion that you've seen claim numbers increase. Can you give us an idea or a percentage about that?
We're very good at defending claims. If I look at the last 15 years, 30,000, 32,000 cases, we've only ever had 3 successful claims against us, which were horrendous mistakes. I mean, no 2 ways about it. But we've seen a lot of malicious attempts at claims. And this year, if it's gone up 100%, I'm probably being conservative.
Really? Wow.
It really has increased. Yeah, I mean, it's, look at the issues that come up. They haven't turned into claims, obviously, but people trying it on because they want to get money back for whatever reason, threatening us when the ombudsman is definitely becoming more common. But that's across industry, though. Everyone's seeing that. Yeah. But it definitely has seen an increase this year, without a shadow of a doubt, and a significant one.
And you talked about the way that GPT and AI has the ability to sort of hone in on issues that, perhaps Conveyancer might have missed. Is that the thrust of the complaint? Is that how people are sort of identifying a way to get at you, or is it just more generally around some of the things that we historically understand to be sort of major issues around complaints, as you've already identified, fall throughs, communication?
Yeah, I mean, there are 2 issues. There's service issues and there's negligence issues. Certainly, we've had people. I'm just thinking of some recent examples where one of the things we're seeing is where we've given advice. You need to buy an indemnity policy, say, for example, or your property is not exempt from BSA because of the way that you own it and so forth. That's becoming definitely more common. We're given advice, and maybe if it's going to affect someone financially, they will say, oh no, but you're wrong on that because I found a way to be able to reduce what you say I need to spend money, and I found a way that I can avoid that. In terms of the claims themselves, we've only had a couple now where we've genuinely missed something, and where it tends to be anomalies across documents whereby we haven't, because it's so complicated now. If you imagine trying to cross-check a property form with a management pack, with a lease, with a deed of variation, trying to pick out the bones with all those multiple documents has been very difficult, and that's something that obviously AI can do quite effectively with the right training. There is a downside. The other problem, of course, is because people are using these public AI, they hallucinate. Mm-hmm. And so what they think is a problem, more often than not, isn't a problem. And that makes it extremely tiring, because then they're saying, we found this, and look, here's a case, or here's an example, whatever. And more often than not, it's an hallucination. And then that just wastes our time. I spoke to one lawyer the other day, and she told me she spent 3 hours arguing with a client who told her that the deed of covenant that they were suggesting wasn't necessary. And it wasn't a deed of covenant at all. But they had put it in, and it had misjudged what it was, and that was 3 hours of explanation of something that was based on an hallucination.
And non-billable time as well.
Yeah. I mean, it is, and as I say, dealing with longer complaints, it's going to take you longer, because you do have to reply to every single point, and that is dead time. No one gets paid for complaint handling.
It's interesting to hear you talk about that particular example, because what I take from that is that people place as much, if not more, trust in what Google AI says than their lawyer. Is that what you're finding?
It's an awful suggestion. I think anyone listening to this who's doing conveyancing will attest to the fact that a lot of people they speak to could easily do their job. They could easily do their job. I could buy this house myself. It wasn't, I really don't want to pay you, because I could really do it myself. Because don't forget, in our current society, that everyone is an expert. Everyone can be a plumber. Everyone can be an electrician. Everyone can be a conveyancer. Everyone can be a doctor. So there's nothing new there. But when you give people with that expectation more ammunition, and quite reasoned ammunition. If you look at the way that AI now generates reasoning and shows its workings and shows its understanding of how it's going, of course it's going to embolden people. And that can only be a bad thing, I think, to undermine the trust that people have. There is this erosion of trust in lawyers. I think in all professions, actually. I don't think it's just with lawyers.
Well, I was going to come on to that, because you said at the start that you described a breakdown of trust in our world, and particularly sort of post the pandemic. What do you mean by that?
This unwillingness to accept that someone might know something more than you.
Right.
We see this from clients. No, you're not right because of this, this, and this. Okay. That's what you think. This is driven by, I think there has been, and I don't want to get all poetic about it, but I think there has definitely been a societal disconnect between people since the pandemic, whether it's people sending their children to school, whether it's the way that people behave towards one another. You go to public spaces now, there's a definite feeling that there is this, it's all about me. And I'm sounding like a grumpy old man now, but I get this from across and I work with a lot of young people, and they tell me the same things. A lack of respect for other people in all situations. My colleague was driving to work the other day, pulled over at a traffic light, and someone got out the car, opened a car door, and started having a go at her. And she was really upset by that. And I thought, would that have happened 5 years ago? Don't know.
It's an interesting trend. My father's a GP. I've mentioned him on the podcast a few times before, actually. And I think the medical sector would attest to that as well, because, you see people come in and they have an ailment, whatever it might be, and Dr. Google has told them that it's this. And of course, the GP says, well, no, actually, I think it might be that. And well, no, I'm not too sure, It's definitely an issue. And interesting that you describe it as an erosion of trust, but definitely a lack of understanding and respect for people's expertise.
100%.
So if we kind of put this back and contextualize it around conveyancing, what does it mean for the sector? And, how do conveyancers, if I can tap into your knowledge and your experience here, how do conveyancers deal with this, and how have you dealt with it at the partnership?
I think the first thing that conveyancers have to do is recognize this issue and not just brush it under the carpet. The problem with lawyers, and as I say, I've been in this business long enough to speak authoritatively on this. Lawyers just want an easy life. They want to get on things. They want to do things that's best for the client, and they don't want to cause problems. They don't want to have arguments in general. They just want to get on and do the right thing. And so the problem comes is that it's like, oh, here's another problem. So it doesn't matter whether it's stamp duty holidays or whether it's BSA or all these things. Lawyers just, they might have a bit of a sulk or they might have a bit of a moan online, but typically they'll get on and they will work 12 hours a day to make this work. They can't do that with this. And what we have to do, and we talked about this, about people being too busy and not spending enough time, we have to recognize the fact that if you are already experiencing these problems, you have to get ahead of it. And you have to deal with it, because it's not going to get any better. It is only going to get more intense, and it's only going to be more difficult. So what we did at the partnership, we said, we better get ahead of this, because this is coming. So what we did back in February, we enabled our lawyers to use a closed large language model that would just work with our data and only internally. And we said, have a play with it. Try it out. We put in place what we called our AI champions, which were guys who were really enthusiastic about it. It didn't matter whether they were junior, senior, across the whole organization. And we said, have a play with it, and we want you to tell others about what you found and how much time it saved and what things it spotted. And that's been amazingly successful. So we're just coming to the end of that process now after 6 months. And what we did was we took a lot of those ideas and we said, right, we're now going to build that into our Legalito product, because we said, this is what we're finding and we want to share this with other lawyers. Because it was from our experience of the issues, whether it's to do with, source of funds, source of wealth, or whether it was problems with defective leases or comparing property particulars with leases that were defective. We had to deal with this because we knew that if we didn't deal with it, it was going to come back and bite us. And so that's what we've been investing in time and energy on that, to give it to the hands of the lawyers and to overcome the fear. Now, one of the most interesting comments that we got from one of these people was, this is a big change for us because we've lost our monopoly on knowledge. And that is a very scary phrase. And when I've gone out and spoken to lawyers about this, to begin with, it's quite, oh, things will be okay. And then we show them what technology can do. And suddenly you get this hush. And it's not very pleasant. You get this hush in the room where people say, wow, this is really finding quite nuanced, complicated stuff. And my argument and my position on this is, yeah, okay, we've written a really clever tool, okay, but that tool can be used to some extent in the hands of anyone. And that's a really, really difficult message and a very sensitive message, which is why we're not going out there and saying, right, come on, throw away everything and start using this now, because of the sensitivity around it. And it's a real challenge. But what I would say to lawyers is, you can't put this off till tomorrow. And that's not me trying to push any of our technology or anything like that. That's just me as a business owner looking at risks, looking at claims, and realizing that for the first time ever in our history, we've got a situation where we're going to have our ability and our expertise possibly be usurped by technology. And I think it will. And that's an awful thing to say, because a lot of people listening to this will have spent many, many years training and getting qualified. And their skills are going to have to change. It's not that they're going to take their jobs. And I also don't, this specious argument about, oh, lawyers using AI versus not using AI, okay, that should not be a discussion we should be having. Everyone has to use this. Everybody has to use this, and they need to get on board. They need to be comfortable. They don't have to be AI experts, but they need to start going, how can I use this? And also what needs to change, which is a challenge, is the importance. And what we've done is put more importance about how we communicate with our clients and the way we communicate, because this is going to be our differentiator, not our expertise and our ability to spot things. And that's a very, very, very difficult message, but that's where we see the future for lawyering.
I want to come back to that, if only because the vast majority of complaints to your own business, because we've talked about this, but also to the Ombudsman, because the data's there as well, is around communications. Let's come back to that. But before we do, I want to just divert very quickly onto AI. It's been done to death on the podcast, if I'm honest, but come back to the point that we've made time and time again, which is that AI is not going to replace the lawyer, but the lawyer that understands how it will augment their role will be much more successful than the lawyer that doesn't going forward. Does that kind of paraphrase what your point is?
It is. I think that the lawyer that can use it to find information quickly and present it in a way that is effective to clients will be more successful, combined with that lawyer that says, actually, I know that this has been flagged up, but it's not a problem because of X, Y, Z. There's a bit of a dichotomy there, because if we need experienced lawyers that can identify what or isn't important and what isn't important, where on earth are we going to find these from if we're not training them through their own knowledge? And one of the challenges that we see is that when people get to a point whereby they trust the AI implicitly, and it will come to that, I can tell you now, it will come to that. We're already seeing this with Google searches where people are now only looking at the AI section now. Then our problem is, how are they cross-checking it with the original documentation? And it's funny because most people say, well, of course lawyers will cross-check it. I get that. They will, up to a point. And then what happens is, what on earth do we do with the fact that then we're not looking at original documentation? And people say that will never happen. I think it will, because then how do they know what is relevant and what isn't relevant without experience? And more importantly, how are we going to train the new entrants coming through the market to learn and get this experience if they don't have to do the research and the learning and the finding out for themselves? And I can't answer that question, and that's again in the too difficult pile.
And to sort of take that a step further, I get that completely, and that is not a question I'm going to answer either. But we then need to integrate into that training process the ability for them to use the AI.
Yes, and it does have a very strong role to play.
Yeah, and that doesn't happen. The current further education system simply doesn't do that. That is definitely a debate for another day.
That's another day, yeah. But we should. It is, ironically, it's a really good learning tool. Ironically, but it's how you measure it and monitor it.
I said I'd come back to the communication point because I remember as a much younger man, I worked for a search company. And I'm sure I've told this story before on the podcast. I went to Chester. There's a lovely cobbled street in Chester next door to the law courts. And there are about 10 law firms, or there were at that point in time, 10 law firms on this cobbled street. And the one I was due to go see was right at the end. And so I wandered past all of these firms, and I remember thinking to myself, how on earth do these organizations differentiate themselves? Mm-hmm. And of course, historically, it would be on expertise and that kind of thing. But what you're saying now is that you believe in your organization, the way you differentiate yourself is through communication.
It has to be, and that's a challenge, but it has to be our ability to present information that can be got from any source and interpreted by any technology. Where we are going to be successful is how we manage the relationship with people that refer us work. So how do we feed back updates and information and so forth about what's going on in cases in a way that those referrers appreciate? How do we solve problems? And how do we give responsiveness, appropriate responsiveness, that makes people go, you know what, I really like the partnership, because whenever I called them back, maybe it wasn't immediately they returned my call, but it was always within the same day, or it was always, or maybe they would message me within 24 hours, but they always came back to me, and there was that consistency of service. I've always said you don't have to reply to people immediately, but whatever you do, you've got to be consistent about it. And I think that's where theoretically we should have more time on our hands to be able to speak to clients, to be able to speak to referrers, to other lawyers, theoretically. Because if we're having to do less administrative work, if we're having to do less looking up of information on the UK Finance website or double checking a portal of the local authority for planning permissions, then theoretically we should have more time in which to invest in picking up the phone and talking to people.
We've started down this AI technology path, and I didn't want the conversation to be entirely around this, but I do just want to drill into some further thinking around where liability starts and ends with technology, because we're not going to cede control of a conveyancing transaction to technology, but at the same time, where does its role start and finish, and therefore its liability start and finish? And of course, there's an element of, people involved in that as well, and how they interact with it. And going back to your point about consistency, having a consistency in the way in which people interact with the technology as well, and use it to augment their role.
I think it's a very good point to make, in that you're absolutely right. There is this feeling that if there's some amazing technology out there, that suddenly the world turns on its head and we give everything up and we forgot everything that we ever do. That I don't agree with that. It is always going to be down to the individual, down to the person, because we're dealing with other people, and it's people to people that are going to be in control of what is or isn't given to the client. The problem about liability is much more clear-cut than people are making it out to be, in much the same way that if we miss something, as one of our human lawyers miss something in a document, or write something wrong, maybe auto text create something in a document, or maybe we spell something wrong, it's our fault. We are never going to get away from that. And there is this feeling of, oh, but if the AI makes a mistake, I would love to see any law firm defend the fact that an AI made the mistake. And I'll draw a parallel with fraud. Okay, if you as a law firm give away money inadvertently to a fraudster, you cannot defend against that. Everyone knows this. You can't. It's your fault. And I speak from personal experience. If you do this, you are on the hook. Why? Because as a lawyer and as a law firm, you were responsible for that breach of trust. As I say, I speak from personal experience. You cannot defend against it. You will always, the responsibility will always end up with the lawyer and the law firm. That is why it's so important that the lawyers and the law firms out there recognize the fact that the human in the loop, if you want to call it that, will always be there and will always be responsible. The challenge is, we can say, but what happens if this technology makes a mistake? My answer to that is just as simple. There's a reason why we pay hundreds of thousands of pounds of insurance every year, because I've got humans that have good days and have bad days and make mistakes or get distracted when the phone rings. We are just as fallible. I think on balance, from what we've seen, humans are probably more fallible than technology, unfortunately, on balance, but we're all fallible. I had someone come back to me yesterday talking about some technology. They said, well, it does make mistakes. I said, yes, it does. And it will always make mistakes, and the humans will always make mistakes. And our job is to try and reduce those. I was at a major law firm the other day, and they said, we must remember that our primary role here right now is risk management. And that's what we're about. Nothing is infallible, and it's human or machine, but it would always come back to the law firm, unfortunately.
We are fast running out of time on the podcast, and I want to kind of bring it all back to the start of the discussion, which is about lay people being more informed, home movers being much more informed about transactions, suddenly making more complaints and identify more issues within transactions, and wanted to finish really on a point around how lawyers can defend themselves around that, because again, going back to conversation that we had before we started the recording, the only way that firms will be able to defend themselves is by presenting data that categorically refutes the claim.
Yeah, I think access to information is key. We've seen this as a law firm when you get that call, oh, you helped me buy that house 5 years ago, and I always say you get a little bit of sick in your mouth, and then you offer up a prayer to two gods, one of which is the God of inquiries, and the other one is the God of reports. Did I ask the right questions, and did I get the right answers, and can I evidence that? And did I report that to my client, and can I evidence that? And unless we get a lot better at recording what we're advising, what information, what questions we're asking, and what answers we're getting, then we're never going to address this issue. And people need to understand this. The annoying thing for me is that 99.9% of lawyers I speak to 100% get it. 100%. They say, we need to know, especially owners of law firms, we need to know exactly what every question they're asking and every answer they're getting. The problem is they don't necessarily have the technology that makes it convenient enough for them to do that. And that's one thing that we need to look at, is the convenience of storing stuff in a place whereby in 5, 10, 15 years, whatever it takes, we can get that information out. The good news is that actually AI could be our friend there. Because what we can do is we could throw AI and say, we've got a horrible mass of data and all these documents. Could you pick out from those emails and all that kind of stuff the questions I asked and the responses I get? So that could be our savior, ironically.
I don't think anybody can kind of argue with that, Peter. You're usually much more outspoken, but that seems to make an awful lot of sense. It's been great to have you on the podcast. It was an issue that, you, as I say, you flagged in an article for the publication. So I appreciate you coming on and kind of fleshing it out. Thank you very much indeed for joining.
That's been really good. As I say, we genuinely want to make things better. And I think only by having frank and open discussions about the perils and otherwise of businesses, that's the only way we can do this.
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining the podcast, sharing your expertise. The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to Peter for joining again. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.